This is In Focus, a Creamer Media Insight series focusing on key economic issues. I'm Marianne Webb. In this third of 5 episodes on copper, we move from supply and demand into territory that's increasingly shaping both geopolitics. The United States, the European Union, and a growing number of governments have designated copper a critical metal, a recognition that its strategic importance now rivals its industrial one, and with good reason. Copper runs through everything that defines the modern world: machinery, digital systems, transport, infrastructure, and communications. Securing future supply has become a matter of strategic national interest. To explore that dimension, I'm joined by political scientist and economist Gaylor Montmasson-Clair from Southern Transitions, a climate and transition think tank. Gaylor, welcome. We talk a great deal about the technology and capital behind the energy transition, but beneath all of that is a scramble for the raw materials that make it possible. How central is copper to that geopolitical scramble?
Yeah, thanks, Marianne, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be part of that episode. The best way to think about copper is as the connective tissue of the energy transition. There is no electrification without it. And the data tell the story. Back in 1970, production was roughly around 6 million tons per year. We're now roughly at 23 million tons per year. And the projections say that we should reach above 40 million tons by 2040. We see, as you pointed out, copper in a vast number of products. And already clean energy accounts for almost a third of the demand for copper. And we're likely to see that rise to over 50% by 2050. And so it is not just a commodity anymore. It's really a strategic input. Importantly, a few countries hold most of the reserves. And that is really where Africa enters the story. Yes, the two largest countries in terms of reserves are Chile and Peru, but then come the DRC as the third, and Zambia is also a significant producer. And so this scramble that we are describing for minerals really puts African countries, at least the DRC and Zambia, at the core of that equation. And so that really opens a window of opportunity for countries to play a much bigger role in solving that equation between supply and demand and making sure that the demand for copper is met through increased benefits for African countries specifically and other producers, of course, primarily in the global south.
China controls a dominant share of global copper smelting and refining capacity. How exposed is the rest of the world to a disruption in that part of the value chain?
Well, the short of it is very. Concentration in the value chain is extremely high. You pointed out to it. China refines about half of global copper. And if we look over the past few years, over the last 10 years, China has pretty much added the totality of new smelter capacity, with a few exceptions. And so there's definitely some choke points in the system. We have reserves that are distributed across a few countries, but largely concentrated. And then the smelting and refining is extremely concentrated in China. Disruption could come from a number of angles. We could see restrictions, of course, on particular exports. We could see a redirection of Chinese production internally, effectively, at the expense of other consuming countries. What is clear, though, is that to this day, owning the rock has not translated in owning the value chain. And that has been a big tension, particularly from, of course, the side of the DRC and Zambia and other African producers. And so that again provides an opportunity to think about value creation differently. Most consumers are now looking to diversify away from China in terms of the supply of copper, of refined copper. That again puts, I think, the copper producing countries in a position of strength to negotiate and say, we can offer a solution to, of course, diversify the supply of the copper itself, but not the supply of the beneficiated products and the copper products themselves. And that is the ambition that is driving what the DRC and Zambia are both trying to do separately, but also interestingly together through a joint special economic zone that they are putting forward.
Now, we are seeing a race among major powers to secure copper supply through trade agreements, state-backed investments, and diplomatic pressure. How is that competition reshaping supply chains?
So, of course, this scramble for the minerals is playing across the globe. And we see that very much on the African continent in the DRC and Zambia as a really clear case of those dynamics. Chinese investors, both public and private, are trying to control the access increasingly to the mines, either through ownership or through trade deals. That's very clear in DRC, where over half of the copper production is directly controlled from Chinese investors. But more importantly, it's the trade flows that matter. And that is really where the battle is at its highest. The US and the EU are backing projects like the Lobito Corridor to try to really direct the flow towards their geographies. The tension, though, that remains is these initiatives, both from the side of China, but also the US and the EU, are still very much along the same model of extraction from pit to port, effectively, where African countries and other producers would see very little benefits. And so the competition that we see between these geographies, in my opinion, provides quite a strong opportunity for African countries to demand, to ask for more, and to say, we have the leverage now to effectively play a much bigger role in those value chains and not just be suppliers of raw materials. The ambition here is really to produce more of the refined products and to build those downstream industries, but also the ecosystems around the industry. And that is something that, constitute a window of opportunity that needs to be seized. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, both DRC and Zambia are looking to it in some ways, trying to control more the minerals that they export and demanding more in their interactions with partners. I think, though, what's missing yet is a very strong regional cooperation angle. One cannot be oblivious to the power dynamics, of course. DRC or Zambia negotiating against China, the EU, or the US is not a level playing field. But doing that jointly brings significantly more power, especially once we account for, of course, the share of production that comes from various African countries. And that could really provide a springboard for a more balanced relationship and a push for value creation and value capture from the side of African producing countries and, of course, other producing countries in the Global South. And so the realization of these strategies is really important. It is one thing to wish for a joint special economic zone. It's another to realize it and to get all the partners across to really be on the same page and jumping into technology sharing, skills development, upgrading strategies to work together effectively to invest for the benefit of all effectively into those projects. because the key here is that building the value chains in African producing countries serves the resilience of the global value chain and the global supply chain for all suppliers, current refiners, and of course the consuming countries across the globe.
Beyond state-level competition, there are external risks such as conflicts, shipping disruptions, and political instability. How vulnerable is the copper supply chain to those kinds of shocks?
Indeed, there are quite a few risks and shocks that could disrupt the value chain. And these are material in a context where demand is increasing and increasing quite rapidly. The fact that the supply is relatively concentrated means that any disruption in those supply countries, could it be from energy supply shocks, for instance? Let's look again at countries on the African continent. Both DRC and Zambia rely heavily on hydropower. We know that that's at risk in the current context of climate change. That could impact supply very radically, and it has already in the past. Conflict themselves can be a source of risks. Of course, we know of the situation in the eastern DRC, which concentrates a large share of the copper and cobalt mining. And so until a really sustainable solution is found in the region, that's putting a lot of the supply at jeopardy. Then shipping choke points can be real. I think it's obviously very fresh in everybody's mind given what's happening in the Middle East. But even from a copper and cobalt perspective, if we look at DRC and Zambia, for instance, these are both countries that are effectively relying on infrastructure corridors to export. That could be through, the Lobito corridor mentioned earlier, or the Tassara route through Dar es Salaam, or also, of course, through the southern route to South Africa. But in each cases, it relies on a corridor of roads, of rail, of ports. And these are vulnerable, of course, to their own sensitivities. And then lastly, I think there is a growing tension between the policy ambition of domestic producers and the geopolitical play of consuming countries. We see a lot of domestic producers now wanting to capture more value from their production, a logical claim and an imperative for most countries. But against that is, of course, a big push from consumer countries led by the US and the EU to effectively perpetuate largely the same model of accessing the minerals without any meaningful beneficiation. That's putting a lot of tension in the system because these goals are not aligned. We need to now move past, I think, those agendas to find ways to, again, elevate the debate and say, look, if we want to increase resilience in the value chain away from choke points in supply, that means developing more production and more value addition in those key producing countries like DRC and Zambia, and of course others in Peru and Chile and others. And so that is really important that we don't now replicate the problem through these corridors and again perpetuate a situation where we see a bit to port strategy, but that we really kind of reintegrate the imperative of supporting value chain development, value creation, value capture in producing countries. Because at the end of the day, that is the only viable strategy, both from the perspective of supply and demand countries. And that would then alleviate a lot of the potential other conflicts that, come from the value chain itself or the situation in domestic countries, because then, of course, value would be translating into much more stable and sustainable situations across the board.
Final question, Gaylor. Is the copper supply security challenge being taken seriously enough?
The short answer is probably not, uh, or at least not at the level that the data demands that we take it seriously. Of course, you mentioned it in your introduction, lots of declaratory politics. Copper is now on every list of strategic or critical minerals or green minerals. It's part of strategies, it's part of an increasing focus on partnerships and MOUs. We're talking a lot more about copper, no doubt. But there is still a massive gap between declarations and announcements and actual action on the ground, actual implementation. The situation over the last few years hasn't really shifted. Actually, if it has shifted, it's towards more and more concentration, where more of the same, more tension between supply and demand countries, an increasing push on the refining and smelting front from China to capture even more of the value chain, and no, real investment inside at scale that we can see. Consuming countries are still very focused on securing access to the mineral itself, so either through buying shares into mines or through supply deals, rather than building the value addition in countries, in partnership countries, which is what we really need to see if we want to have a more resilient value chain. I would say that producer countries are still undervalued and are underestimated as actual meaningful partners. Of course, we also see that the tension between effectively the US, the EU, and China is ramping up, and the rest of the world, particularly producer countries, are very much collateral damage within this conflict at this point in time. What is important, though, is to recognize the window of opportunity from the side of producing countries. That includes the RC and Zambia. So we now have a much more powerful position in the value chain itself. And that position, with the increased demand that we are seeing and that we are likely to continue seeing in the years to come, is only going to strengthen the position of African countries and other producers. So the first thing is really to realize that opportunity and to act on it, to not miss this window of opportunity that is not going to last forever. And so that requires us to take this a lot more seriously from a domestic perspective, but also from a, I would say, a regional and continental perspective, as informed by the recently approved African Green Mineral Strategy that was approved last year by the African Union. But at the same time, it also needs to inform the way we deal with partners, because we cannot go at it alone. And so that means renewed and reshaped partnerships with traditional partners in the US and the EU and China, as well as new partners. We now see increased investment from India, from Brazil, from Gulf countries. A renewed partnership really to say, let's work the problem together, really to raise the benefits for the whole system. And if one is really serious about looking at how to raise benefits for the whole system, the only viable path is to find ways to bridge the supply and the demand by increasing really the value addition and the value creation and the value capture in producing countries, particularly in the global south, like DRC and Zambia. The cost of inaction really is just going to perpetuate patterns that we've seen that are unequal and extractive, and it's not going to lead to resilience. It's not going to benefit anyone in the system. And so that is really, I think, in my opinion, the window of opportunity that we see at the moment to break from decades, if not centuries, of past dependency towards a more sustainable resilient, and mutually beneficial system and value chain for all.
Gaylor, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today. The geopolitical dimension of copper supply is increasingly hard to ignore. It is also reinforcing copper's growing strategic importance to mining companies and investors. In our next episode, Helen Amos, commodities analyst at BMO Capital Markets, joins me to examine why copper has become the portfolio story of the moment.